product of an incomplete investigation.
The whole thing is a sham. 5 days to do the investigation.
It's very frustrating that they didn't do a thorough investigation.
Democrats debating whether this was thorough at all, with Republicans who say the FBI has done enough. Well, my next guest agrees with the Democrats. William Scheuerman went to Yale with Brett Kavanaugh. He writes about living with Brett Kavanaugh and the FBI never returning his call. I'm also joined by Judge Robert S. Smith, a conservative former federal appeals court judge who had supported Kavanaugh but has now withdrawn that support, writing, "I blame him for letting his anger impair his judgment. He needs to learn the words, 'I'm sorry.'" And as if that wasn't enough tonight, folks, we have of counsel to the beat, Maya Wiley, former counsel to the mayor of New York and an MSNBC legal analyst. Thanks to all of you for being here for a substantive discussion. I start with you, Mr. Scheuerman, as the roommate. What happened when you tried to reach the FBI? What did you want to convey?
Well, I wasn't the roommate. Let's be clear about this. I lived in Lawrence Hall during the same time that...
hallmate.
Hallmate, well, yes, I lived down the hall. I put it this way. I lived in entryway A. The alleged event with Deborah Ramirez took place in entryway B. What I tried to supply to the FBI was a list of names of people who were likely at that party. I had learned from colleagues here at my university that the FBI may not have had that. One can't assume these things, and I thought that would be useful information. The FBI didn't get back to me. At first, I thought nothing of it. I thought they were on top of their game. And then I started getting emails from classmates of the residents of Lawrence Hall. And it turned out a lot of people, including people who had some truly important information, were not being contacted by the FBI. And of course, this is extremely unsettling.
Is your view that you and or your classmates have reason to think that Ms. Ramirez was credible?
I think it's credible. I do think we need an investigation. And I think what's being called an investigation, it's not. It's a con job. And I say that, I don't say that lightly, but I will say that because, in fact, I provided names. I know other names were provided by Debbie Ramirez's lawyer. I know, and I think you just mentioned this on the program, one of my old friends can corroborate that Debbie Ramirez talked about this back in '83, '84 with him. He approached the FBI, and the FBI did not contact him. And there seems to be a pattern here of not just the usual sort of bureaucratic neglect or benign neglect, but of a conscious effort to make sure that some of these stories don't get out there. And that, of course, is extremely problematic. We need an investigation before we can reach, a final judgment on this whole thing, and we did not get that.
Maya, what does that say to you? Because one of the key ways that you can corroborate claims against people, prominent people, famous people, because there can be reasons that people may come forward falsely, is whether there was earlier corroboration.
Right, exactly. I mean, any time you're trying to assess what happened, and you have two different people saying opposite things, what you're looking for is what kind of confirms the credibility of either of them. And key evidence to that is whether or not they told people at the time that something that they've said happened, and whether they tell it in the same way, right? Does the story change? Does the story stay consistent? And that is corroborating evidence, and I think that is what's so disturbing about essentially handcuffing law enforcement here by not allowing the FBI to do their job.
Judge, we live in a world where many people bring their ideology or their hopes to how they view these conflicts. You are a judge, so if you were any good, your job, you're a retired judge, your job was to look at the evidence, not preconceived notions. And you, up until recently, were a Kavanaugh supporter. What evidence changed your mind?
Well, for me, it's entirely about the Dr. Ford. I'm not worrying about the Ramirez allegation, which I regard as unproved, and I'm not really in favor of turning over every rock to see if you can prove it. With Dr. Ford, I listened to her story. I found it compelling. I find it almost impossible to believe that nothing happened between her and Judge Kavanaugh. And I was very disappointed in his testimony. I understand that he's been through a horrible experience, and I want to say that he's someone I had admired and thought very well of, and perhaps in some ways still do, because he's had a distinguished career for decades. But I thought it was a very disappointing testimony, and to me, you've got an allegation of serious wrongdoing. It's not It's a credible allegation. It's not credibly denied. If I had to make this decision, I would say it's just not right to confirm the nominee. And I would say that very unhappily because, in my opinion, he's an excellent nominee.
Well, that speaks volumes, that you may reach that decision with sadness, but you reached it based on the evidence. I also want to dig into something that I know you're careful about, and I think we should all think about as viewers listen to you. There is a debate over what should be disqualifying for nominees, and that is a broad debate, and we can all acknowledge that some of those standards have changed over time. And then there's a debate about how nominees go through the vetting process. What was your view of the way Judge Kavanaugh handled himself on Thursday? And if you find Dr. Ford credible, does that mean in tandem you found him less than credible or potentially perjurous as a sitting federal judge?
Well, I'm not going to throw around the word perjury, but I was not happy with it. I've already said I was unhappy with his testimony. I was particularly upset with the one that someone referred to earlier, the idea that you use a girl's name with the word alumnus as a caption to a group of football players. And he tried to sell the idea that this was a respectful display of platonic friendship. I just don't buy it. And to me, it's upsetting because it suggests that if he'll deny that, what won't he deny? And isn't the fact that he was once a kid who drank too much and behaved badly, and I don't know how badly he behaved, and it's probably not disqualifying if we knew all the facts, but he really ought to recognize that.
Maya, I wonder what you think of the judge's clear point here that can get lost in the wider and important discussion of how we deal with sexual assault, which is that even if you hold out the idea that there could be a genuine disagreement about long ago facts, well, what the judge is saying here on the beat is you have a nominee, a sitting federal judge, appearing to mislead in clearly provable ways the committee as he is considered for this promotion.
Absolutely. So I think we have a judicial code of ethics, actually, for the federal bench, and Judge Smith is someone who has upheld those ethics, I think, in his career, is a perfectly important person to listen to on this. The importance of the bench of judges is to be unbiased, but also to demonstrate integrity, truthfulness, and honesty as part of that integrity. When that is not in evidence, or that there are sufficient questions that that's not the case, we actually lose credibility in our judicial system, and that's something we have to protect. So even if it's not about whether Judge Kavanaugh is guilty of a crime. It's about whether Judge Kavanaugh, as someone who would become a Justice Kavanaugh, continues to uphold the credibility of the bench. And one other point is the American Bar Association in 2004 gave him the gold standard, right, as the Republicans often say, when they evaluated his qualifications. Well, in 2006, they downgraded that, in part because they felt like he was demonstrating bias. And then by this nomination process, they actually called for a full investigation. That has not happened. So part of what we're seeing is even the neutral bodies, including the 1,700 law professors that have said, on this issue, on the issue of the credibility of the bench and the appearance of bias and honesty, this is a significant disqualifying issue.
It's put very well here at a panel with people who know a lot about it. And I should mention on a personal note, Judge Smith and Maya Wiley know each other from Brooklyn, as we say around here, BK to the fullest.
That is true. That's absolutely true. That we do know each other from Brooklyn. I am not. I want to dissociate myself slightly from the idea that Judge Kavanaugh has forever tainted himself from performing as a Supreme Court justice by his performance. I told you I didn't like his performance. I wasn't happy with it. And if I had a vote and were uninfluenced by political considerations, and you find a senator like that, I probably would vote no. He may be confirmed. If he is confirmed, I have some hope that he'll be an excellent justice. He's been, from everything I know, an excellent judge for many years.
Right.
I hope that this will prove an aberration. And I really hope that people on both sides of this, when it's over and when it's come out, will respect the result and try to support the institution, even if they're not happy with the outcome.
Well, the way you speak, and we don't get that many retired judges on TV, and most sitting judges have reasons they can't do TV interviews. What we get from you is something we could all use right now. That's my opinion. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.